Thank you, Christina. And officially, you're witnessing the youngest speaker ever on Caixin stage. But also, the message is powerful that you can tell from this year's Caixin Summit. Sustainability is really the key, and is really something we care deeply, not just on the leaders of today, but also from the leaders of tomorrow. So we want to, through our little tiny effort, to build a cross-generational, intergenerational dialogue. The next speaker is also our keynote speaker for the Singapore and also for the Beijing venue as well. Senior Minister Tharman SHANMUGARATNAM. We will switch to our Beijing venue, and I will use Chinese to connect with them. 北京的同事，黄珊在吗? All right, we're in Beijing venue now. So without further ado, I will introduce and also invite Senior Minister to take the stage and deliver a keynote speech, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask a few questions with him. Please, Senior Minister Tharman. 有请上达曼。
Well, good evening, everyone in Singapore and Beijing. Thank you for inviting me to join you. This Caixin Summit was first started 12 years ago, I believe, and it's worth reflecting on how the world has changed in this last 12 years. At that time, the world was emerging from the global financial crisis. There was a mood amongst the leading international players, US, China, Europe, India, smaller players like ourselves in Singapore. There was a mood of wanting to strengthen international trade, investment, and cooperation with each other. And there was a mood in the developing world that things were moving up. Things were moving up. There was an opportunity to rebuild after the global financial crisis. Today, we are in quite a different world. We don't have a financial crisis, at least not yet, but we have a crisis arising from multiple dangers and multiple threats that are all coming together at the same time. It is far more complex, far more profound, and also it is not about 1 or 2 years. It's not like the global financial crisis. The world came out of it within 2 years. In fact, it rebounded. The world economy rebounded after 2 years. This is different. We're now in for a prolonged period of difficulty, fragmentation, and vulnerability. And we must first understand that situation in order to avoid the worst, but also rebuild optimism. We have to rebuild optimism everywhere in the world through our own national actions, our own domestic actions, as well as through international collaboration. The mood, I look at the title of this conference, New Development, Shared Opportunities. The risks to development have never been greater in the last 40 years. And the conviction in developing shared opportunities through international collaboration has never been weaker as well in the last 40 years. We are at a weak point. We are at a weak point of multilateral cooperation and a willingness to engage in collective action to solve what are problems of a much graver nature than we have faced in the last 40 years. So the need or the demand for multilateral action and collective action is stronger than it has been in 40 years, but the supply and the conviction required for multilateral action and collective action is weaker than it has ever been in 40 years. And we have to address that. We have to first recognize the nature of the challenges we face: economic, environmental, and geopolitical. We have to avert the worst, prevent the worst, but more than that, we now have to build new bases for optimism. The economic challenges themselves are serious ones. We are likely to enter a recession next year in many parts of the world, and a large part of the world will feel like it is in recession. It's going to be a tough year. Inflation is not something that can be suppressed quickly. It is typically suppressed with some pain, with some economic pain. Economies have to slow down. And this is the price we pay for central banks having been too slow to recognize the nature of the risk, too slow to recognize that inflation was going to be more persistent than they had expected. And we now have to pay a price. Plus, there are difficulties of a domestic nature within the major economies, and Europe faces sharp difficulties because of the war in the Ukraine. We have to make sure that populations can be protected to some extent from the worst effects of inflation and recession, and we require collective action and solutions within our own nations to be able to ensure that societies hold together and know that if we get past this, we can build a new phase of growth that is inclusive and sustainable. But it will be a difficult time, and we have to prepare for that. Our largest challenge are the challenges that the world faces together: climate change, the risk and in fact the likelihood of repeated pandemics, a global water crisis, which is the least recognized of the environmental crises we face, the crisis in the global water cycle, which shows up in extreme weather events in one part of the world after another, and sometimes within the same country, you have heat waves and droughts in one part of the country, and extraordinary flooding in another part of the country. And the extremities are now severe than we have ever seen, and in fact exceed what the scientists expected. The weather extremities exceed what the scientists have expected. If you take what's happened in China this year, the heat wave that has affected a significant part of China, the duration and the scale, geographical scale of that heat wave is the largest in recorded history. But it's not because of something happening within China, it's something that's happening in the regions around China, Russia, Central Asia, because that's what's gone wrong in the global water cycle. It is a global problem, just like climate change is a global problem. And when we face problems in one part of the world, flooding in Pakistan, droughts in parts of Africa and China, forest fires somewhere else, it's actually part of a global problem. And we have to understand that it requires global collective action to tackle climate change, the water crisis, and importantly too, to prepare for the next pandemic, because we are still completely unprepared. We have to build on the important steps taken through the G20's efforts, starting last year, continued this year, the setting up of a new fund, greater coordination, but the efforts are still far too weak, far too small. And as it stands today, we're not going to be able to prevent the next pandemic, which could come at any time. It just requires a small switch in the influenza genome for us to face a pandemic far more catastrophic than what we have seen with COVID. And we must understand that. This is not science fiction. This is real science The pathogens are already out there, the risk is already there, and it could happen anytime. And we have to take this very seriously. It requires global collective action, pooling together resources on a basis that's affordable to all nations. And we're still not there. We're not there. We're not putting together the resources, coordinating surveillance everywhere in the world. Each time a new pathogen or virus is detected, everyone must know quickly so that we can react quickly and stop it in its tracks before it becomes a full-scale pandemic. We need to set up that system. It's in every country's interests. So those are the environmental shifts which are the most daunting, and they affect the world at large, and they require global solutions. And to address all these challenges, economic and environmental, and to address the challenge of development, because it's the developing world that now faces a real risk of a rollback in development, a rollback in the achievements of the last 30 to 40 years, especially the last 20 years. There's a real risk of rollback because of these repeated shocks due to pandemics, extreme weather, and now, of course, an economic crisis. In order to address these challenges, we need a new understanding and a new equilibrium in international affairs, in geopolitics. We need a new understanding between the US and China in particular, because that's the most important of the relationships between countries in the world. We need stability, but more than stability, we need a way of collaborating between the major powers, with the mid-sized powers, and small countries like Singapore and many others playing our role. It's an opportunity. Our biggest challenge is to prevent a multipolar world from becoming a polarized world. That it is becoming multipolar is inevitable and is, in fact, a triumph of the international system because it has enabled more countries to grow over the last 40 to 60 years, and we have succeeded in having more poles of growth and more poles of influence. That itself does not mean a polarized world. It just means that growth is more widely distributed, and there are more sources of growth, more opportunities, and more poles of influence. And we have to ensure that that system does not mean a more polarized world, where you get bifurcation, where you have separate alliances of countries, because that will be a very dangerous world, and it will be a world with less economic prosperity for all populations. And that has to be our fundamental objective, to tackle the environmental challenges we face, to tackle economic crises, to bring peace everywhere. We need that geopolitical pact, that new understanding between the major powers and with smaller players everywhere in the world playing their part to keep the world open, connected, and to avoid breaking apart into separate alliances. That has to be the underlying and most important challenge for us to focus our minds on. So let me stop there. I thank you once again for inviting me to speak. I'll be happy to take questions and to have a further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Senior Minister Tharman. And as you once argued that we're now confronting a perfect storm, and you have a long list of the challenges we're facing, the economic crisis, the climate change pandemic, and most importantly, preventing a multipolar world becoming a polarized world. Facing all those challenges, and like you said, these tend to be long, maybe a decade or generation of challenges like that. What are the key attributes of leaders today to tackle that, of leaders should have to tackle that?
Well, first, as I've mentioned, it's not just a perfect storm, but it's going to be a perfect long storm. We're going to be saddled with these problems for many years to come. It's not about one or two bad actors, although we have bad actors. It's not about a few bad events. We've entered an era of insecurity, geopolitical insecurity, economic insecurities, and most fundamentally, environmental insecurity. And we have to address it not by waiting for each crisis to come and responding to crises as they come, but by seeking to prevent crises from developing and by preparing for them in advance. The most classic example, because it's on everyone's minds and it's fresh in our minds, has been the pandemic. But the pandemic was not a surprise event. It was predicted. We knew it was coming. The scientists had been warning about it for some time. No one knew exactly which pathogen or virus it would be, but the scientists had been predicting this. And the next pandemic is coming as well. So these are predictable events. We have to prepare for them. We have to seek to prevent them. We may not be able to prevent an outbreak of an infection, but we can prevent it from becoming a global pandemic. And that's why we have to now shift our whole mindset of governance within countries and globally towards thinking about how we prevent and prepare and not just wait for crises to come and respond. Because if we keep waiting for crises to come, first, it is extraordinarily expensive and costly, economically and financially, to deal with them. Second, it comes at much greater human cost to human lives and cost to social cohesion. So we have to address issues upfront. Think of the future not in terms of what we hope to see and plan on the basis of what we hope will happen, but plan on the basis of what could plausibly go wrong. Think of what could go wrong, take action early to prevent that from happening and to prepare for that, because that's the way in which we can build optimism. We're not going to be building optimism if we keep waiting for crises. So we need to build optimism by thinking of how things can go wrong and preventing it from happening and building opportunity on that basis. That's, I think, the first orientation we must take internationally. Secondly, I would say, the nature of the largest problems we face are of a collective nature. These are basically what economists would call collective action problems. We need to act collectively to solve a collective action problem, be it climate change or pandemic preparedness or the challenges of economic development in the world. It requires collective action, collective pooling of resources, putting our resources together, multiplying the resources in order that they can be deployed internationally to address the challenges of development. Likewise for climate change, likewise for all the challenges of the global commons that we face. So we have to also have that mindset that problems are not going to be resolved nationally. There are national problems that can be solved nationally, but the largest problems we face are now of a global nature, and they require global collective action. And we have to understand that that is in the interests of each nation itself. It's in the interest of humanity and the interests of the global community, but it's also in the interests of each nation itself. If we can't stop a pandemic from happening within one country, we can't stop it from happening globally. We can't stop climate change by addressing it only through individual national actions. Some countries acting very responsibly. Everyone has to act responsibly. And we have to put together our resources. We have to pool our resources in order to strengthen what's called global common goods. We have to strengthen that, besides strengthening public goods nationally. So that's, I think, a fundamental challenge of leadership everywhere, given the nature of the challenges that we face in the years to come.
Thank you. You mentioned always think about what could go wrong. And that's, people often use that to describe the leaders in Singapore. And if I can quote former leader Lee Kuan Yew, who said back in 2009 that if Singapore's perennial challenge is to remain competitive, then each successor generation must build on the country's assets to work out their solutions to new problems. So if we zero in to Singapore, what are the new problems facing the 4G, the new generation of leaders in Singapore, and are they prepared?
The 4G leadership is very engaged in thinking of the future, the challenges and the opportunities. Even as you succeed in one phase of growth and development as a country, you'll find new challenges coming your way. And in a small country, that's very clear. Because the world changes around us, it's not as if we've got a large buffer domestically. We're a very small country. We can't offset what happens in the world easily. We can't counterbalance what happens in the world easily. So we have to anticipate problems precisely because we have to then position ourselves to be able to avoid the worst, but also position ourselves to contribute to solutions globally. And that's the orientation we take in Singapore, and it's certainly the orientation of the 4G leadership. One of the challenges we face around the world, and especially in small countries, is going to be the challenge of building resilience in the face of global shocks and a more fractious and difficult international environment, be it about supply chain uncertainties, conflict between major powers and the like. We will all need greater resilience. And resilience is not something that you have to invest in, and then you find that it is at the expense of achieving economic growth. Resilience is going to be the basis for sustained growth and improvement in the quality of life within our own populations. So the countries that are the most resilient are the countries that are going to be able to sustain improvement in the lives of their people. And that has to be a priority everywhere, not just in Singapore. And in Singapore, it's of course a sharper priority because we're so small. So building resilience by building trust within our society. We have built I think a fairly deep reservoir of trust within our population, between the population and the government, as well as between people themselves. And it was very evident in the pandemic, the trust between people and the trust between the people and the government was relatively strong. Not perfect, but relatively strong. But we've got to keep building that because trust is something that you have to keep renewing. It's not as if you earn trust in one generation and it lasts for subsequent generations. You have to keep rebuilding and renewing trust in a society. And that is a challenge which every new generation of political leaders has to be focused on. Singapore will have to navigate the challenges of a world that is gradually becoming decoupled, although we hope it won't be, a world that faces more shocks from time to time. But we will have to focus on some of our intrinsic strengths, not unique to Singapore, but which we place a lot of importance on in Singapore. Because these intrinsic strengths will give us resilience and enable us to navigate a changing world. What are these strengths? First, trust in the Singapore system itself, the standards we maintain, the predictability of regulation, the fact that we keep our neutrality. Keep our neutrality is a very important feature of the Singapore system. Second, talent. Talent at every level of society. Developing expertise at every level of society, at every level of the workforce. That has to be a Singapore strength, not just through the education system, but through lifelong learning, and by being a place where global talent is able to congregate and work together with Singaporeans. So Singapore has to remain an open place for talent and a talent hub. That's the way we got here, and that's the way we're going to go forward as well. So that's the second element, talent. A third element, I would say, is to really make the most of the innovation economy. You know, we're coming out of a world where we've had close to zero interest rates in most of the major economies and globally, zero or negative real interest rates, a world of excessive liquidity for more than 10 years now, and that's now being unwound. It's being unwound. And we have to focus less on the financial economy, which is what a lot of investment was about,
It's really investment within the world of finance. Focus less on that and focus on investment in the innovation economy, the real economy that creates value. And that's a real opportunity for Singapore too. The innovation economy is now global. It's no longer concentrated in one or two places. Some large countries, like the United States, China, increasingly places like India, have the advantage of sheer scale of market, the ability to roll out innovations quickly at a large scale. But small countries like Singapore play a very important role as well. Because of our standards and our regulatory system, because of talent and the diversity of talent, and importantly, by being a place where new ideas and inventions can be tested. In other words, a place of proof of a concept. We have to be a place where you can test bed and demonstrate the potential and validity of new inventions. And that's something which we do quite well and which we are very focused on. And finally, I guess we are lucky to be in this part of the world. Southeast Asia is growing faster than most places. India is growing faster than most places. China is still growing. We are in Asia, which is still looking up, still wanting to open up, still wanting to strengthen interconnections. And that's an advantage for a place like Singapore. So there will never be a period in our history where we are not faced with new challenges, sometimes very sharp challenges. And each time we come across those challenges, we have to think not only of how we deal with it in the short term, but how we can develop opportunity even in an era of challenge.
Thank you. And we spent a lot of time talking about climate change and sustainability. And Caixin Summit in Beijing will have a whole day tomorrow on ESG. But the low-hanging fruits are gone, both for the political leaders and for the business leaders. Many of them are here today. What would be your advice to them in really tackling the sustainability problem effectively and lastingly?
Well, I think first, I was listening to the earlier session, which was polling people and polling the young people. I think the young people were closer to the objective reality than the general audience. The world is today on track for above 2%, above 2 degrees increase in temperature. It's very clear, the scientists are very clear about it. We are well on track to exceeding 1.5 degrees by a significant margin. And that's why we are already in trouble. The weather extremities, the extreme weather events are going to happen more frequently because we are already crossing the tipping points. The tipping points are not something that happens in 2050 or 2100. The tipping points are already being crossed. If you look at what's happening in the Antarctica, what's happening in what's called the boreal forests in Russia and Alaska and various other places, the changes that are already happening are now going to have a domino effect on the oceans, on the overall climate, and it's going to have unpredictable consequences. So we already have a crisis, and we're going to see it intensifying in the years to come. We are behind in this race to combat climate change. The global community is behind in the race to combat climate change. We have to accelerate actions everywhere, and we need stronger collective action globally as well to address it. And that means everything from each country needing to do its responsible part to be able to price carbon and to help redirect resources based on a system of pricing. Governments will have to subsidize some activities so as to enable renewables and more efficient ways of running an economy. In other words, energy efficient ways of running an economy. It may require some period of subsidy so that costs can come down, which is what happened for solar and wind. Certainly what happened in China and in parts of Europe, that's how costs came down. Because there was a period when there was large-scale experimentation with some public subsidy. And we are going to have to think about innovation, because it's going to require significant investment in innovation to be able to catch up with climate change. The reality is, Asia in particular is going to rely on fossil fuel for a few decades to come. Renewables have to be built up as quickly as possible, but Asia is continuing to grow, and it still will be relying on fossil fuels. So we need innovations to first reduce the carbon emissions coming out of fossil fuels, for instance, from coal plants. So the whole issue of carbon capture for coal plants is a very important issue for investment in innovation. And there are already many companies that are working on this. And I'm just giving one example. We have to think of how brown can become less brown, and brown eventually becomes close to green. And we have to think about growing green at the same time. That transition path of making brown less brown and increasingly green, and investing heavily in new alternative clean energies is fundamental to the next 10 years especially, and it's going to be something that needs scaling out in the subsequent years. So apply our minds to this problem with a mindset of investment in innovation and scaling out innovation.
Thank you. And the last question, well, this segment's title is Leadership in the New Year. I want to finish by asking about the new leaders. So you've shared the session that we have a new leader sharing their view about climate change. If you look at the young generation, they're inheriting a rather challenging world. The geopolitical tension, the supply chain disruption, the climate change, pandemic, you name it. What will be your advice? I know you're passionate about education and enabling the young generation. What will be your advice to the leaders for tomorrow?
Well, my advice is that globally and in many societies, we went through a phase of celebrating the individual. It was partly because previous systems were discredited, centrally planned systems, some other systems in Europe as well as Asia and some other parts of the world were discredited. And there was a phase in which we had to grow the market economy. That turned out to be a very successful phase. But it has also led to a spread of individualistic cultures in many parts of the world. To face the challenges of the future, we now need the market system as well as a collective mindset. Rely on markets as much as we can, but we need a collective mindset because public goods need investing. We need to mobilize the markets to invest in public goods. Social cohesion is an increasing challenge, and we need a spirit of taking care of each other because we are part of the same society. People may be doing different jobs, they may be having different pay, but everyone needs to be respected and everyone can be developed further in their lives. That has to be the spirit. Take collective responsibility. And finally, we must recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that we also have to recognize global collective responsibility, that we've got to cooperate globally to tackle the largest problems we all face. Helping another country, helping another population, collaborating globally is critical, not just for the sake of international cooperation, but for the sake of each nation itself, because the problems are intrinsically of a global nature. The largest problems we face are of a global nature, and they can be only tackled by strengthened global cooperation.
Thank you so much, Senior Minister Tharman. Collective mindset, responsibility, and action. With that note, please join me in giving a big round of applause to Senior Minister Tharman for your insights. Thank you. Thank you.